In this video, we're going to look at how to implement a very simple version of Tic Tac Toe, or Noughts and Crosses is the alternative name for it. It's a really good project for practicing use of 2D arrays and subroutines in our code. So yeah, we're going to start with the main bit of code for the actual gameplay. Okay, so I'm going to create a subroutine called main to begin with. Okay, and the first thing I'm going to do is create a variable called player turn, and this is going to store which player's turn it actually is. And in Tic Tac Toe, the first player is to start is cross, so I'm just going to use an X to represent that. I'm going to create a Boolean flag variable called finished, which I'm going to set to false, and I'll be using this later on. I'm going to create the board now. So this is going to be a two-dimensional array, or list of lists in Python technically. So I'm going to create a list first, and then I'm going to create 3 more lists in that list. So we've got 3 lists in this one list, and this first list is going to represent the top row. And what I'm going to do to represent the blank spaces in the board, I'm just going to use a hyphen. So I want 3. This is going to be a 3x3 grid or board. So I've got 3 blank spaces there represented by a hyphen character. And I'm going to just copy and paste that and put them into the other 2 rows like so. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is create a loop for the game. So while not finished, okay, so this basically means while this finished variable equals false, so you can write it like that. So while not finished, so basically as long as the game isn't finished, we're going to keep doing this procedure. Okay, I haven't written this procedure yet, or this function. But I'm going to create a function called display board. So I want this to keep displaying the latest version of the board as we put players onto different positions within the board. So that's going to say display board there. The next thing I'm going to do is get the user to input the location of where they want their player to go on the board. So the first thing, they need to enter the row and column number. So I'm going to have variables for these called lock for location row and lock col for location column. I have a little message there saying enter call number. I might actually just print player X starts. So the user's note. So and then I'm going to have a subroutine, a function called update board, which I haven't created yet. And in this, I'm going to pass in the board as a parameter, the location and column that the user entered, and which player it actually made that move. Okay. So what this function will do is it will update the board. So wherever the user wants to go into that board, it will change. So if the user enters 0 column, if they enter 0 1, that'll be row 0. In column 1, so their player will so this hyphen will change to that player's icon, so the X or the naught, and it will update the board like that. Okay, then I'm going to have a variable called result, which is going to check, which is going to get that result is going to come from a function called check game. So check game is we're going to use that to check if that player who just played has actually won the game or not, or if it's a draw, or if the game is still continuing. Okay, and to do that I'm going to pass in the board and which player it is that we're checking the game has been won for. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this loop here. Yeah, and I'm going to write some of these subroutines now. So I'm going to write the display board subroutine to begin with. So I'm going to put this right at the top, display board. I'm just going to use the same parameter name as the value that's been passed in. Okay. So in this subroutine, like I said, we're going to display this list of lists on the screen. So to do that, we need to use a nested for loop. So we're going to have an outer loop that loops through basically the rows, if you like, and then we're going to have an inner loop or nested loop within that, and this is going to display the column for each row. This is going to iterate through the columns in each row, and as it does that, we want to print each of those values in that row. So this outer loop is referring to the specific row in our list, in this board list of lists, and then within each one of those, this is going to, so the nested loop is going to iterate through each of the items within that row one at a time. And so as it's doing that, we wanted to print and access each individual element, each individual item in that row, and print it. So it will just print it on the screen. Okay, so we want to print board IJ. Now the reason why we have to use a nested loop is because we want it to display as a grid. So you can only do that if you use a nested loop. So so at the end of the row, what we want, after each item has been printed, we don't want it to add a new line, because by default when you do a print statement, each time that print statement is called, it will add a new line, and we don't want, if we don't want to add a new line for each item in our board, because it will just display one vertical line. So to stop that from happening, after we've accessed each item, if we put end equals empty speech marks, that will stop a new line being added to the end. And then after it's looped through that entire first row, we then actually do want another line added. So then the next row will appear as another row on a new line. So after we've looped through the nested loop, we just call a print statement with nothing in it, and that will add a new line on its own. So then this will display the board as a grid. Okay. So let's just see if that works for now. I'm going to comment these last two out. Let's just see if that displays the board. No, we need to actually call the main function. Okay. So yeah, now it's displayed this grid like so. So it's displayed it exactly how we want it. So if I take away this end here, I'll show you what this will do. So yeah, it will each value will be put on a new line, which is not what we want. So we need that end equals empty speech marks, so it doesn't keep adding a new line within each item in the row. Right, so that's the display board subroutine done. Now we want to create the update board subroutine. So this gets called when once a user has entered the row and column number where they want their X or naught, their cross or naught to go. So we're going to call this update board, and this is going to take 4 parameters: the board, row, column, and player. Okay. So if you're unfamiliar with subroutines, so these are the values. So the values in the brackets, these are the values that come from the place where we call this subroutine. So this subroutine, for example, display board, we've written this subroutine here, but it doesn't actually do anything until we call it. So we call it on another in another line of code somewhere else. So we call display board here, and we pass in this parameter when we do that, which is this variable here, board, and that goes in to the parameter, and then that subroutine, that function can then use that parameter called board and do things with it, like access different values in it. So in update board, we're going to call update board here. These 4 different values will be passed in, and those values go one at a time in the same order. So they don't have to have the same name. Whatever the values of these are, get passed into the parameter in the same order. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add some validation checks to the values. So basically, we want the users to make sure they enter a row and column that is actually available on the board, and we want them to make sure they choose a row and column in the board where a player hasn't already put a value. So to do that, we're going to do if row is greater than 2 or row is less than 0. So if they enter a row that is less than 0 or greater than 2, that will be a position that's beyond the boundaries of the board and doesn't exist. That's invalid. So we want to do that for columns as well. Okay, or so because they're together, they need to be in brackets, and same for the column check as well. Or if the board position row and column, the values of row and col come from the user input, remember. So the user inputs lock row, lock col there, and those values get passed into this parameter call here. I'm going to row and col. So if that doesn't equal value of hyphen, okay, so if it doesn't equal hyphen, that means a player will have already taken that place, so they can't go there either. So basically what we want to do now is if any of this is true, it basically means it's invalid. So we want to print a message saying invalid position. Choose another. And then we're just going to get them to enter the row again. Like so. And then it will check it again. So the idea here is that they might enter another row and col position that is also invalid. So this will keep checking that until they enter one that is valid. And then once they've exited the loop, that means they must have entered a row and column that is valid. And so then we can update that position with that player value, either the X or the naught. So that value will go will be that location in the board we updated with the value of the player's turn. So that's update board. Let's just see if that works now. So let's just see if it updates the board. So if I enter, so player X starts, so player X goes first. So if I enter row 0, row and column 0, X goes into the top left of the grid, like so, and it should be noughts go next, but we haven't written the code to do that. But we can see the update board is working. Let's just see what happens if we enter a invalid. Invalid position, choose another. Okay, great. Let's now do the function for check game. So check game. Okay, so this is a little bit more complicated, but it's actually quite straightforward, really, because we're just going to use if statements. And what this will do is it will check, like I said before, if the player has won. Once they've taken their turn, it will check if they've won the game or not. So to do that, we need to check the rows. And to do this, I'm going to use a loop to loop through all the rows. So if board in position I 0 equals the value of player and the value of position I 1 equals player and the value of board I 2 equals player. If that's true, then the player must have won. So we're just going to return the player value, and I'm going to explain why later on. But basically, yeah, this basically means, so this is a for loop, so I starts at 0. So this means if the player at the board position row 0, column 0, row 0, column 1, row 0, column 2, so that's i.e. one row, if they are all equal to the player value that we've passed in here, either x or naught, then they must have won. So we're going to return the player value for that, and then it will check the row. If they're not all equal to player, it will check the next row. So I will then become 1, and it will check board 1 0. So that's row 1, column 0, row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2, and so on. Okay, so that's going to check the rows. And we can have return player here, because if this is true, then basically that player must have won. So we just return, and we can exit the function straight away. So when you hit a return statement in a function, it won't execute any more code in that function, and it will just return that value and go back to where the line of code where that function was called. Here, check game. Okay, so now let's check the columns. So this time, very similar code, but I'm just going to swap these values around. Okay, so that will check the columns in the same way as the rows. The next thing that we want to do is check the diagonals. Okay, so for this one, we're just going to use 2 if statements. Okay, so one for top left to bottom right, and one for top right to bottom left. Okay, so for top left to bottom right, so it just needs to check row 0, column 1, row 1, and row 2, column 2. And then the opposite way round, we start at row 0, column 2, row 1, column 1 in the middle again, and row 2, column 0. Okay, so they would also return player if either of those are true. Okay, now we want to check if it's a draw. So basically, if none of this is true, but we don't have any more blank spaces left, then it must be a draw. So to check for this, I'm going to create a variable called all spaces taken. I always think it's better to write your Boolean variable flags how you would read them, because it makes your code easy to read later on. So for I in range 3. So we're basically going to loop through the entire board to check if there's any blank spaces left. Okay. There's probably a more efficient way you could do this. You could also use a counter to count how many places have been taken. But I'm going to do it this way. So this is all spaces taken equals false. Okay. So what this means is, we assume first of all that all the spaces are taken, and if at any point when we're looping through the entire board, if at any point we run into a blank space, then all spaces taken must be false. And then after that, those loops there, we can then just have an if statement saying if all spaces taken, then return the value d, which means draw. And if none of that has been, if none of those if statements were hit, then none of those return statements were hit. So that must mean it's not a draw, no one's won the game, and so we just carry on. So I'm just going to return the value n here, as in not finished. Okay, so we're going to go back to the main code here. So that results that either N, D, or the letter of the player whose turn it is will be stored in result. Okay, so this is what we want to do with result now. So we're going to have an if statement here. So if result does not equal N, finished equals true. Okay, so the game's finished. So then if it's finished, we want to put out the appropriate message depending on who has won or if it's a draw. So if result equals X, then print X has won. Elif result equals O or naught, then O has won. Elif result equals D, then print draw. Okay, so after that if statement, that will deal with if the result is that if the game is won and what to say. Otherwise, we just continue the game and we change who's with the player's turn. So if the player turn is currently X, then we need to change the player turn to naught. Otherwise, we change it to cross. And put a nice little message, print player turn player, and just use the value of the variable player turn. Okay, yeah, so basically all this happens, remember, all this happens on one player's go. So once a player has entered their go, we then update the board, we check to see if they've won, and if not, then we change the player's turn to the other player, and then it'll loop back round and do the same thing again, and it'll keep going until someone's won or drawn. So let's see if that works. So player X starts. So So if I enter row 1, column 1, that's gone in the middle. So now the player turn is 0. So I'm going to go 0, 0. Player X, so I'm going to go 2, 1. And player 0 again, I'm going to go 0, 2, because player 0 is not very good at this, and then the cross is going to go 0, 1. X has 1. There you go. Probably shouldn't have printed player turn there. That's something else we can fix later on. But that's how to make a very simple, straightforward game of Tic Tac Toe or Noughts and Crosses on this side of the Atlantic. So we've got some subroutines there, some if statements, some for loops, two-dimensional arrays or lists. So a great set of skills to practice there. And it's a really good one to develop a little bit further and make some improvements here and there. You could improve the how the board is displayed, and think of a little bit different ways to make it a little bit more efficient. But yeah, thank you for listening.